There is a rule in intelligence work that every handler learns early and never forgets. The most dangerous asset is not the one who gets caught. It is the one who came to you. In the entire recorded history of modern espionage, no intelligence service has ever recruited a source as perfectly positioned as the man Israel was about to meet. Not because they found him, not because they targeted him, studied him, or ran a 2-year operation to turn him, but because on an ordinary afternoon in London, in 1969, he picked up a phone and called them. His name was Ashraf Marwan. He was 25 years old. He was charming, educated, immaculately dressed, and possessed of the kind of unshakable self-confidence that either belongs to the genuinely gifted or the genuinely reckless. He was also the son-in-law of Gamal Abdel Nasser, President of Egypt, the most powerful Arab leader alive, the man whose photograph hung in homes from Casablanca to Baghdad, the symbol of an entire civilization's dignity and fury and hope. And he was calling the Israeli embassy to offer them everything. To understand what that phone call meant, what it really meant, beneath the obvious, you have to understand the world Ashraf Marwan was calling from. Nasser's Egypt was not simply a country, it was a project, a declaration. The idea that the Arab world could stand, unified, against the powers that had carved it up and humiliated it for a century. Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956 and survived the military response of Britain, France, and Israel combined. In the streets of Cairo, in villages across the Arab world, people wept when they heard his voice on the radio. His household was, accordingly, the most guarded inner circle in the Middle East, and Ashraf Marwan had married into it. In 1966, Marwan married Mona Nasser, the president's third daughter. It was not, by most accounts, a union that Nasser welcomed. Marwan had pursued Mona aggressively, almost defiantly, and the marriage had happened over the family's quiet resistance. Nasser accepted it. He did not embrace it. What Marwan found on the other side of that marriage was something that no one who had watched him pursue it could have predicted. He found contempt. Not loud contempt. Not the contempt of confrontation or argument. The contempt of being looked at by the most powerful man in your world and found simply, finally, without discussion, insufficient. Nasser never trusted him, never gave him real responsibility, never treated him as a man who belonged in the rooms he now had access to. And Marwan had access to extraordinary rooms. He worked in the presidential office. He attended meetings. He traveled in official capacities. He was, to the outside world, a man of significance, the president's son-in-law, present at the edges of history. But presence without power is its own particular kind of wound, and Ashraf Marwan spent years collecting that wound in the most sensitive corridors in the Arab world, surrounded by men who took him for granted and a father-in-law who looked through him. What that does to a person is not simple. It is not simply resentment, and it is not simply ambition. It is something more volatile than either, a combination of both, mixed with the specific fury of a man who knows he is capable of more than he is permitted to demonstrate. The Mossad did not know any of this when the phone rang. They were about to find out. Inside the Israeli embassy in London, the call from Marwan created a problem that had no clean answer. The man on the phone was either the greatest intelligence opportunity in the history of the State of Israel, or he was an Egyptian operation, a plant, a deliberate, sophisticated provocation designed to insert a source into the heart of Israeli intelligence who would feed them a carefully constructed reality for years. Both possibilities were real. Both were terrifying. Because if he was genuine, turning him away meant surrendering access to the inner workings of the most consequential Arab government alive. And if he was a trap, running him meant that every piece of intelligence Israel thought it was receiving from Egypt could be, from the very beginning, a lie constructed in Cairo. The question the Mossad's European chief Shmuel Goren sat with, in the days after that call, was not simply whether to trust Ashraf Marwan. It was whether the concept of trust even applied to a situation like this one. Goren chose to meet him. The meeting happened in London, a hotel, 2 men at a table, speaking quietly. Marwan was calm, not nervous, not eager in the way that genuine walk-ins often are. The trembling, over-explaining quality of a person who needs to convince you of something. He was almost bored. He placed an envelope on the table. Inside were the official protocols of secret Soviet-Egyptian arms negotiations conducted in Moscow, classified documents. The kind of material that only a handful of people in Egypt even knew existed. The kind of material whose exposure could, in the wrong hands, unravel diplomatic relationships that had taken years to build. Goran examined them. They were real. What Goran said in that moment has been repeated in intelligence circles ever since. Material like this from a source like this is something that happens once in 1,000 years. He was not wrong about the material. What Goran could not have known, what no one in that room understood yet, was that the question of why Marwan was doing this would never be fully settled. Not in that hotel room. Not in the years of operation that followed. Not in the war that the operation was building toward without anyone yet knowing it. And the answer to that question, whatever it actually was, would eventually become the most dangerous thing about him. Marwan was given a code name, the Angel. It would prove, in time, to be one of the most bitterly ironic designations in the history of modern espionage. He began passing information formally in 1970. Soviet arms deals, Egyptian military capabilities, the internal dynamics of the presidential office, the texture of power at the very center of the Arab world's most significant government. His handler, a man known in the operational record only as Dubi, ran the day-to-day contact. But the Mossad's chief, Zvi Zamir, made a decision early that would define the entire operation. He would meet Marwan personally, not delegate, not review reports from a distance. Meet him, face-to-face in European cities as often as operationally possible. The reason was not sentiment, it was calculation. What Marwan needed, what the psychological profile of the man demanded, was not simply money, though he was paid very well. What he needed was to be seen, treated as consequential. Given the respect that the most powerful man in his life had always withheld, the Mossad would give him that. And in doing so, they would make themselves dependent on a man whose deepest motivations they understood well enough to exploit, but not well enough to fully trust. By the early 1970s, Nasser was dead. Anwar Sadat had assumed the presidency of Egypt, and Marwan's position transformed in ways that the Mossad had not anticipated and could not have engineered. Sadat trusted him, gave him responsibilities so sweeping they were almost difficult to believe when the documents were later declassified. Marwan represented Egypt personally before heads of state. He represented Egyptian intelligence to foreign services. According to the mandate Sadat gave him, no action could be taken by the Egyptian armed forces without his personal consent. The man reporting Egypt's most sensitive military secrets to Israel held effective oversight of Egypt's military operations. The cover was not simply holding. It had become something else entirely, something the Mossad had no framework for, something that raised a question they did not ask aloud, because asking it would mean confronting an answer they were not ready for. If Marwan was this trusted, if Sadat had given him this much, what did Sadat actually know about who Ashraf Marwan was? And if Sadat knew or suspected, then what exactly was Marwan being used to do? By 1972, the Mossad believed it understood Ashraf Marwan. That belief was the most dangerous thing about the operation. They understood his motivations, the wounded ego, the father-in-law's contempt, the hunger for significance that Egypt had never satisfied but Israel quietly fed. They understood his access, which was extraordinary and growing. They understood his psychology well enough to manage it, to calibrate how much attention Zamir paid him personally, to ensure that the relationship remained what Marwan needed it to be. What they did not understand, what no one in the operation had yet reckoned with, was that a man this valuable, this central, this perfectly positioned, was also a man whose exposure would not merely end a career, It would end everything. Running a deep asset inside a hostile government requires a specific kind of operational discipline that is easy to describe and almost impossible to maintain over years. You must never become dependent. You must never allow the asset to become so central to your intelligence picture that you cannot function without him. Because the moment that happens, the asset stops being a source and starts being a vulnerability. You begin protecting the operation not because it serves your mission, but because you cannot afford to lose it. You begin making decisions based on what the asset can give you rather than what reality requires. By 1972, the Mossad had lost that discipline entirely. Marwan was not a source anymore. He was the source. Egypt's order of battle, its weapons inventories, its diplomatic back channels, its military planning, all of it was flowing through a single man, a single relationship, a single cover that had never been tested under real pressure. And no one inside the operation was asking what would happen if that cover failed. There was a reason for that silence, and it was not incompetence. It was that the cover seemed, by every available measure, unassailable. Marwan's position under Sadat was legitimate. His travel to Europe was expected and documented. His meetings with foreign officials were part of his official mandate. There was no false identity to maintain, no fabricated biography that could unravel under questioning, no legend that required constant management. He was simply Ashraf Marwan, doing what Ashraf Marwan had always done. The lie was invisible because it was built inside the truth. And invisible lies are the kind that intelligence officers stop checking. What the Mossad did not know, and would not discover until much later, and perhaps never fully, was that Egyptian intelligence had, by the early 1970s, developed a suspicion. Not about Marwan specifically, about the fact that Israel seemed to know things it should not know. The Egyptian military and intelligence services had noticed, in the careful way that professional paranoia produces, that certain operational details appeared to reach Israeli awareness through channels that could not be fully explained. The pattern was not definitive. It was not specific enough to name a source, but it was there, a faint, recurring signal in the noise of failed operations and compromised timing. Someone was talking. Egyptian counterintelligence began, quietly, to consider who that someone might be. In Tel Aviv, Marwan's intelligence was being processed by Ayman, Israel's military intelligence directorate, and filtered through an analytical framework that had calcified into something close to doctrine. The doctrine was simple. Egypt would not go to war until it could neutralize the Israeli Air Force. Egypt could not yet do that. Therefore, regardless of what any source said, war was not imminent. This assessment was held with the confidence of people who had been right before, in the way that past accuracy can become the enemy of present judgment. Marwan had been sending warnings. Not vague warnings, specific, detailed, operationally grounded warnings about Egyptian military preparations, about Sadat's intentions, about the seriousness of what was being planned on the other side of the Suez Canal. Each warning went into the system. Each warning was reviewed. Each warning was measured against the doctrine, and each warning was filed away. Inside the Mossad, this created a fracture that was quiet at first and then increasingly difficult to ignore. Zamir and his senior officers had a source they trusted completely, a source whose track record was extraordinary, whose access was unparalleled, whose material had never once been demonstrably wrong. And the institution responsible for acting on that source's intelligence was, systematically and without apparent discomfort, setting it aside. The argument inside the Mossad was not dramatic. It did not involve raised voices or confrontations in corridors. It was the quieter, more corrosive kind of institutional disagreement, the kind where one side has the evidence and the other side has the authority, and authority wins. What it created, in operational terms, was a specific and serious problem. Marwan was taking enormous personal risk to deliver intelligence that was not being used. If he ever found that out, And a man with Marwan's access and intelligence would eventually find that out. The question of whether he continued to take those risks had a very uncomfortable answer. In early 1973, Duby raised something in an internal Mossad discussion that had not been said aloud before. What was the exit? Not an emergency extraction. There was no mechanism for that, no safe house prepared, no exfiltration route established for a man this public, this recognizable, this embedded in Cairo's official life. The question was simpler and more fundamental than that. If the operation ended, if Marwan's cover was threatened, if Egyptian counterintelligence got close enough to require shutdown, what happened to Ashraf Marwan? The answer, when examined honestly, was that there was no good answer. He could not defect publicly. The political consequences for Israel of revealing they had run Nasser's son-in-law as an asset would be significant. The personal consequences for Marwan's family, for Mona, for his children, for the legacy of Nasser himself, would be catastrophic. He could not quietly disappear. A man of his visibility, in his position, simply vanishing would trigger precisely the kind of Egyptian investigation that the operation could not survive. He could not be extracted and resettled under a new identity. He was too well known. His face, his name, his biography were woven into too many official records and too many powerful memories. The only viable option, operationally, was for the cover to hold indefinitely. And indefinitely, in intelligence work, is not a plan. It is a prayer. There was a meeting, the details of which remain partially classified, in which senior Mossad officers discussed whether the operation should be wound down. Not because Marwan had been compromised, not because his intelligence had proven unreliable, but because the structural risk of continuing had reached a level that rational operational planning could not justify. A source this central, this unprotected, this without exit, running him was not an intelligence operation anymore. It was a liability dressed as an asset. Every additional month of operation was another month in which a single mistake, a single suspicious conversation, a single piece of information reaching the wrong desk in Cairo could unravel everything at once. The discussion did not produce a decision to terminate. It produced a decision to continue, with increased caution. In retrospect, that decision was not made on the merits. It was made because no one in the room could accept what losing Marwan would mean. And here is where the story requires a recalibration, because everything described so far rests on an assumption so fundamental that no one inside the operation thought to question it. The assumption was this: Ashraf Marwan was deceiving Egypt and serving Israel. That was the operating premise, the frame through which every piece of intelligence was evaluated, every meeting was conducted, every risk was calculated. But there was a man in Cairo who had given Ashraf Marwan more power than any foreign intelligence service could have imagined possible, who had handed him oversight of the Egyptian armed forces, access to every sensitive conversation, the formal authority to represent Egypt's intelligence relationships to the entire world. That man was Anwar Sadat, and Anwar Sadat was not a careless man. Sadat had come to power by outmaneuvering every political rival in Egypt, men who had underestimated him, who had taken him for a placeholder, who had not understood until it was too late that the quiet vice president was the most strategically patient person in the room. He had expelled Soviet military advisors in 1972, a move of extraordinary boldness that reshaped Egypt's strategic position and demonstrated a capacity for long-range operational thinking that his enemies had not seen coming. This was not a man who gave unlimited power to his closest aide without understanding who that aide was, which means one of the following is true. Sadat gave Marwan that power and did not know what Marwan was, which requires believing that the most strategically sophisticated leader in the Arab world failed to detect, over years, what Egyptian counterintelligence was already beginning to suspect. Or Sadat gave Marwan that power and did know, or suspected, and made a calculation that the Mossad never considered. That the most valuable thing Ashraf Marwan could do for Egypt was exactly what he appeared to be doing for Israel. The Mossad was certain it was running Ashraf Marwan. What it had not asked, what the operation's entire architecture had been built to avoid asking, was whether Ashraf Marwan was running them. And in the autumn of 1973, with Sadat's armies preparing to move and a warning that would arrive 14 hours too late, that question was about to become the most consequential unanswered question in the history of the Middle East. October 4th, 1973. Paris. Early afternoon. Ashraf Marwan was not in Cairo. He was not in a meeting. He was not performing the elaborate daily theater of a man who held the formal trust of a president, while quietly dismantling everything that trust was built on. He was in a hotel room, alone, and he had just understood something. The understanding had not come from a briefing. It had not come from a document passed to him in a corridor or a conversation overheard in a ministry. It had come from an accumulation, the texture of the last several weeks, the behavior of certain people around him, the particular quality of silence that descends on a military planning process when the planning is complete, and what remains is only the waiting. Sadat was not preparing anymore. He was ready. Marwan had been here before, or close to here. There had been previous moments in 1972 and before that, when Egyptian military preparations had reached a pitch that seemed to mean something imminent, and then the moment had passed. Sadat had pulled back or delayed, or the conditions had shifted in ways that moved the timeline. Each of those moments had produced a warning from Marwan. Each warning had gone to the Mossad. Each had been absorbed by an Israeli intelligence apparatus that processed it, measured it against its own assessment, and concluded that the conditions for war had not been met. Marwan knew this. He knew the warnings had not produced the response they should have produced. He knew, from the quality of Israeli behavior in the aftermath of each warning, the absence of mobilization, the continuation of normal diplomatic rhythms, that the intelligence he was delivering was being received and then, somehow, set aside. What he did not fully know was why. He reached for the phone. And then he stopped. The call he needed to make, the signal that something urgent was happening, had a mechanism attached to it. An agreed protocol. A way of communicating that the situation had crossed from monitoring into emergency without using language that could be understood by anyone intercepting the line. He had used the protocol before, the reference to chemicals, a list, a specific, apparently mundane commercial conversation that meant, to the person on the other end, that the angel needed an immediate meeting. He picked up the phone again, and again he stopped. The hesitation was not fear in the conventional sense. Marwan had been living inside a lie of this magnitude for 4 years. Fear, the specific fear of exposure, of a door opening and finding the wrong person on the other side, had long since been metabolized into something else. Something more like permanent low-level alertness. The body's version of a held breath that never quite releases. What stopped him was a different calculation. He had warned them before. He had delivered the signal, made the emergency meeting happen, sat across from Dubi and then from Zamir himself, and given them everything he had, the dates, the force deployments, the crossing plans, the Syrian coordination. And nothing had happened. Not on the Israeli side. Not the mobilization, not the forward deployment, not the visible change in posture that would tell him the intelligence had landed where it needed to land. If he made the call again and they did not act again, he would have exposed himself for nothing. Worse, each emergency contact was a moment of operational risk. Each meeting in London or Rome or wherever Dubi materialized from was another data point. Another thread that, if someone in Cairo was pulling threads, might eventually connect. He sat with the phone in his hand. He put it down. He spent approximately 3 hours in that hotel room doing what intelligence assets are never supposed to do, which is independently assess whether the risk of contact outweighs the value of the intelligence. That calculation belongs to the handler. It belongs to the institution. The asset's job is to deliver what they have and let the professionals decide what to do with it. But Marwan had been watching the professionals decide. He had watched them decide, repeatedly, that his intelligence did not require action, and he was sitting in Paris with the knowledge that within days, not weeks, not months, Egyptian and Syrian forces were going to cross into Israeli-held territory simultaneously, and Israel was going to be completely unprepared. He made the call. Duby received the signal and understood it immediately. What happened in the next several hours inside the Mossad's operational chain reflected every institutional tension that had been building for years and had never been cleanly resolved. Duby escalated. The message went up the chain. Zamir was located and informed. And then, before anything was confirmed, before Zamir had committed to traveling to London, there was a discussion that almost ended the meeting before it began. The concern raised was not about Marwan's reliability. It was about timing. The intelligence calendar, the pattern of Marwan's previous warnings, the recurring cycle of Egyptian military preparation that had not produced war, had created, inside a segment of the analytical structure, a category for what Marwan was signaling. It was the category of a source whose access was real, but whose read of imminent timing had been wrong before. The argument made, in that discussion, was that an emergency meeting with the Mossad's chief was an extraordinary operational exposure. That flying Zamir to London on the basis of a signal that had produced false alarms before was a disproportionate response. That the correct procedure was to route the intelligence through normal channels, have it assessed by a man, and respond based on that assessment. Zamir ended the discussion. He traveled to London. The meeting took place that night. Marwan had returned from Paris. He was composed. That was one of the things handlers consistently noted about him across 4 years of operational contact, the composure. Other assets, in moments of genuine crisis, showed it. The voice changed. The hands moved differently. The eyes did something involuntary. Marwan looked the way he always looked, as though the information he was carrying was a professional obligation rather than a detonation. He told Zamir what he knew. The attack would begin the following day. Both fronts simultaneously, Egypt crossing the Suez Canal, Syria moving on the Golan. The timing was coordinated. The preparations were complete. This was not a rehearsal, and it was not a feint. Zamir and Duby wrote down everything. And here is where the incorrect assumption played out in real time, not as a dramatic failure, but as something quieter and more damaging, the way most catastrophic misjudgments actually occur. Zamir left that meeting believing he had done what was required. The intelligence was real. The warning was unambiguous. He had it from the best source in the history of Israeli intelligence, delivered personally, with a specificity that left no room for interpretation. He sent the coded message to Tel Aviv. And his assumption, the assumption embedded in the act of sending that message, in the entire operational logic of what the Mossad had built, was that the warning would be received the way it was intended. That the people on the other end of that telegram, reading that a 99% probability of war beginning the next day had been assessed by the most reliable source Israel had ever run, would understand what was required. He had delivered. The system would respond. In Tel Aviv, the warning landed inside an apparatus that had spent the better part of 2 years building a case against the possibility it was now being asked to accept. The analytical doctrine, Egypt cannot fight without air superiority. Egypt does not have air superiority, therefore Egypt will not fight, did not collapse when the telegram arrived. It bent. It produced, in the minds of the people who received the warning, a search for the interpretation that preserved the existing framework. Perhaps the timing was wrong again. Perhaps this was another instance of Marwan reading Egyptian intent accurately, but Egyptian capability incorrectly. Perhaps war was coming, but not tomorrow. Perhaps tomorrow meant something different in the source's framing than it meant on an operational calendar. The mobilization that Marwan's warning required, the full, immediate, unambiguous mobilization of Israeli reserves, did not happen. A partial alert was issued. That partial alert was the false release moment. The moment where the system produced an action that felt like a response, that allowed the people responsible to believe they had processed the intelligence and reacted appropriately, and that was, in operational terms, almost entirely inadequate. 14 hours was not enough time for a partial alert. It was barely enough time for a full one. The Yom Kippur War began on October 6, 1973. Egypt crossed the Suez Canal. Syria moved on the Golan. Israeli forces, understaffed and unprepared, absorbed the first blow of a coordinated assault that Marwan had described in accurate detail to the head of the Mossad less than 2 days before it happened. The intelligence had been real. The warning had been delivered. The deception that destroyed Israel's preparedness was not Marwan's. It was the assumption held for years, protected from contradiction, institutionally immune to revision, that they already understood what Egypt was capable of. Marwan had told them the truth. They had heard something else entirely. The war lasted 19 days. In the first 48 hours, Israel came closer to military collapse than its public would be permitted to understand for years. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed the Bar Lev line, the defensive fortification that Israeli military doctrine had treated as essentially impenetrable. Syrian armor pushed deep into the Golan Heights. Israeli tank crews, outnumbered and in some sectors without air support, fought holding actions that bought hours rather than ground. The scale of the initial catastrophe was not something the warning system had failed to anticipate. It was something the warning system had anticipated precisely, delivered accurately, and then failed to act on. Inside the Mossad, the fallout began before the ceasefire. The question of what had happened, how a service with an asset of Marwan's quality, delivering intelligence of that specificity, had failed to prevent a strategic surprise of that magnitude, did not wait for postmortems or commissions. It surfaced in real time, in the conversations between officers who had processed the warnings and the analysts who had discounted them, in the specific and unresolvable tension between an intelligence service that had done its job and a military establishment that had not used what it was given. Zamir had sent the telegram. The Mossad had delivered. The institutional argument Israel's intelligence community would spend the next decade having about who bore responsibility for the failure of October 1973 started from that fact and never fully resolved it. 6 days into the war, Marwan provided what the Mossad internally described as golden intelligence. The precise nature of that intelligence, the specific operational detail it contained, contributed directly to Israel's decision to execute the canal crossing that turned the war's momentum. Israeli forces crossed into Egypt. The encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army followed. What had begun as a military catastrophe was arrested, reversed, and converted into a strategic position that eventually forced a ceasefire on terms Israel could accept. The war that Marwan's warning had failed to prevent was partly salvaged by intelligence Marwan provided during it. That fact did not simplify the accounting. It deepened it. Because the question that the Agranat Commission, the Israeli inquiry established in the war's aftermath, could not cleanly answer was the same question that had shadowed the operation from the beginning. What exactly had Marwan been doing? The commission examined the intelligence failures of October 1973 with considerable thoroughness. It reassigned responsibility. It ended careers. It produced findings that reshaped Israeli intelligence doctrine for a generation. What it could not produce was a definitive account of the Mossad's most valuable source, because that account required answering a question about a man whose motivations had never been fully understood, whose position inside the Egyptian state had never been fully explained, and whose final warning had arrived in a form and at a timing that permitted two entirely opposite interpretations. Either Marwan had warned Israel as early as he could, constrained by the fact that Sadat had kept the precise date almost entirely to himself, or Marwan had warned Israel precisely late enough to ensure the warning could not be acted on, and had done so deliberately, as the final and most consequential act of a deception that had been running for 4 years. The commission did not resolve this. Nothing that followed resolved it. The institutional cost inside Israeli intelligence was structural and lasting. The concept built around during the Yom Kippur War, the analytical assumption so deeply embedded that no source, however reliable, could override it, became the defining lesson of a generation of Israeli intelligence education. The failure was not simply that Ayman had discounted Marwan's warnings, it was that the system had been designed, without anyone intending it, to make discounting them the path of least resistance. Careers ended. The head of Ayman, Eli Zera, was censured. Others in the analytical chain found their professional trajectories permanently altered by association with a failure whose scale the Israeli public only gradually came to understand. But Zera did something else, years later, that extended the fallout in a direction no commission had anticipated. He began telling people who Marwan was. The exposure was gradual. Information about a miraculous source who had warned Israel before the war had circulated in Israeli intelligence circles through the late 1970s and 1980s, never officially confirmed, never publicly named. In 1993, Zera published memoirs that included details specific enough to narrow the field considerably. He also advanced, in those memoirs, the argument he would repeat for the rest of his life, that the source had been a double agent, that the warning had been designed to arrive too late, that Israel had been deceived not despite the intelligence but through it. The argument served Zera's institutional interests. If the source was a double agent, the failure was not an analytical failure, it was a penetration. The responsibility shifted from the people who had discounted accurate warnings to the people who had run a compromised source. Zamir understood what Zera was doing. He accused him publicly, in 2004, of unlawfully leaking Marwan's identity to the press. The legal proceedings that followed kept the question of Marwan's true role in public circulation for years. And in 2002, before the legal confrontation had fully developed, an Israeli academic named Aharon Bregman published Marwan's name. Bregman would later describe it as one of the worst decisions of his life. The name was out. The architecture of protection that had held, imperfectly but sufficiently, for 3 decades, the arrangement in which the people who knew kept it between themselves and the people who didn't know had no mechanism for finding out. That architecture collapsed in the time it takes a newspaper to be printed. In Cairo, the response was officially nothing. No prosecution, no formal accusation, no statement from the government confirming or denying what had been published. Hosni Mubarak said publicly that Marwan had not spied against Egypt. The silence beneath that statement was not neutral. It was the sound of powerful people making calculations about what acknowledgement would require, about what silence permitted, about the specific problem posed by a man who knew too much and was still alive and in London and theoretically capable of saying more. Marwan spent the 5 years between his exposure and his death under a pressure that had no formal shape. Legal disputes, business complications, the gradual erosion of the comfortable post-operational life he had constructed in London's financial world. People who had known him as a well-connected Egyptian businessman now knew, or believed they knew, something else entirely. He gave interviews. He was careful. He denied specifics and confirmed nothing. He was a man without a viable position, too exposed to return to the world he had occupied before, too implicated to be protected by the people he had served, too dangerous to be simply left alone by the people he had betrayed. The deception that had sustained him for 30 years had finally run out of room to operate. On June 27, 2007, Ashraf Marwan fell from the balcony of his 4th-floor London apartment. He was 63 years old. He was scheduled to meet a researcher that same afternoon. No one has been charged. The British inquest returned an open verdict. The question of whether he fell or was pushed sits in the same unresolved category as every other fundamental question about his life, documented but not answered, examined but not closed. Egypt buried him with national honors. The state that had, according to Israel's own declassified records, been systematically penetrated at its highest level for the better part of a decade gave the man responsible a funeral that framed him as a patriot. There was no official contradiction from Cairo. There was no official confirmation either. In 2023, 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, the Mossad released documents, a photograph, a transcript, the formal, institutional confirmation that Ashraf Marwan had been real, had been theirs, had delivered intelligence whose quality and precision had never been matched before or since. Mossad Chief David Barnea stated plainly that Marwan was not a double agent. The Egyptian publisher who had translated the book making that same argument was serving a 5-year prison sentence for divulging military secrets. This story does not have a clean ending because it did not have a clean operation. It had a man who walked in from the cold for reasons that were never fully understood, who delivered intelligence that was real and was ignored, who helped reverse a war he had failed to prevent, and who died in circumstances that the official record refuses to explain. If you want to understand how intelligence actually works, not the version with clear heroes and clean victories, but the version where the most valuable asset in your history can warn you of a war and still not stop it, this is the story that repays the closest attention. The documents are declassified now. The questions they answer are outnumbered by the ones they don't.